It was a quiet, rainy evening in the small town of Hollow Creek. Lucas, a college student working part-time as a pizza delivery driver, was wrapping up his shift. With just one more order to go, he glanced at the delivery slip. The address was unfamiliar, tucked deep into the outskirts of town where the streetlights barely reached. The tip promised was generous, though, enough to make him shrug off any unease. He loaded the warm pizza into his car, started the engine, and punched the address into his GPS. The drive began uneventfully, the rain tapping softly against the windshield, but as he neared the edge of town, the houses grew sparse, and the roads turned into narrow, winding paths. Dense woods framed the road, and Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The GPS led him to a driveway barely visible under overgrown branches. At the end of the long gravel path stood an old Victorian house, its silhouette looming like a shadow against the dim moonlight. The house was dark, save for a single flickering light in an upstairs window. Lucas hesitated, gripping the steering wheel. His instinct told him to turn back, but he needed the money. He grabbed the pizza and stepped out into the cold rain. The gravel crunched under his sneakers as he approached the house. The door knocker, shaped like a grinning gargoyle, was ice cold under his fingers. He knocked 3 times. Moments passed. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway lit by a single dim bulb. A pale woman stood in the shadows, her sunken eyes fixed on him. "You're late," she said in a whispery voice. "Sorry, the rain slowed me down," Lucas replied, forcing a smile. "Here's your pizza." The woman didn't move. Instead, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "I'll pay you inside," she said, her voice as hollow as her gaze. Lucas hesitated, but stepped inside, the door closing with an ominous thud behind him. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their subjects' eyes seemingly following him. "Wait here," the woman said, disappearing into another room. Lucas stood in the hallway, clutching the pizza box. From deeper within the house came faint, irregular sounds, a distant drip, the creak of floorboards, and what he thought was a muffled sob. His unease grew. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. Just as he decided he'd had enough and turned toward the door, he froze. The portraits lining the walls had changed. The faces were now twisted in expressions of terror, their eyes wide and mouths agape. The woman reappeared, holding a wad of cash. Her hand trembled as she held it out. Lucas took the money and turned to leave, but she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go out the front door," she whispered, her voice urgent. "They'll see you." "Who?" Lucas stammered, pulling his arm free. Before she could answer, a loud knock echoed from the door. The woman's face contorted in fear. "They're here," she hissed, backing away into the shadows. The knock came again, louder this time. Lucas didn't wait to find out who or what was on the other side. He darted down the hallway, searching for another exit. He found the kitchen, but the back door was bolted shut with rusted chains. The knocking at the front door turned into furious pounding, accompanied by low, guttural growls. Panicking, Lucas turned to find another way out when he heard a whisper right behind him. "They're inside now." He spun around but saw no one. The house seemed to warp around him, the walls narrowing, the shadows deepening. A sudden, piercing scream erupted from somewhere upstairs, followed by a childlike giggle. Lucas bolted back toward the front door, deciding he'd take his chances. But when he reached it, the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered before going out entirely. Lucas fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the oppressive darkness. The beam landed on the pizza box, which had somehow opened on its own. Inside, instead of a pizza, there was a blood-stained piece of paper with one word scrawled in jagged letters: "Run." A low growl came from behind him. He turned the flashlight, the beam trembling as his hand shook. Standing in the hallway was a figure, hunched and unnatural, its glowing eyes locked onto him. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Lucas didn't think, he ran. He tore through the house, every door leading to a room that looped back into the hallway. The growling grew closer, the creature's footsteps unnaturally heavy. Finally, he stumbled into a room that wasn't like the others. It was filled with old delivery uniforms, all stained and torn, hanging from hooks. In the corner was a pile of delivery bags, each one bearing the logo of a different pizza place. Lucas realized with sinking horror that he wasn't the first. The growling was just outside the door now. He had nowhere to go. The last thing he saw before the light of his phone died was a pair of glowing eyes and that grotesque smile. The next morning, Hollow Creek's paper carried a familiar story. Another pizza delivery driver had gone missing, and deep in the woods, the Victorian house stood silent, waiting for its next visitor. On the outskirts of Black Hollow, a small town nestled in a valley perpetually cloaked by mist, a new pizza place called Midnight Crust opened. Its slogan was quirky but ominous: hot and fresh, no matter the hour. Ethan, a high school dropout working the late-night shift, was eager for extra cash. Midnight Crust didn't ask many questions about his past or why he avoided eye contact when asked about his old job. His boss, a gruff man named Mr. Grady, only emphasized one rule: never deliver to Redwood Lane after 11 p.m. At first, Ethan didn't ask why. Most of his deliveries were uneventful: quiet streets, sleepy customers, and generous tips. But as the weeks passed, the curiosity gnawed at him. He noticed other drivers whispered about Redwood Lane, but clammed up whenever he asked for details. One stormy Friday night, Ethan was alone at the store when the order came in. The address was scrawled in red ink: 9 Redwood Lane. His heart skipped a beat. It was 10:45 p.m. Ethan called Mr. Grady to report the delivery, but the line went dead after one ring. A second later, a text pinged his phone: "Deliver it. Don't be late." The rain came down in sheets as Ethan drove into the heart of Redwood Lane. The GPS guided him through winding streets with no streetlights. His headlights barely pierced the darkness. The trees on either side of the road arched together like skeletal fingers, their branches clawing at the sky. When he finally arrived, the house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, looming like a forgotten relic. Its windows were dark, its porch sagging under the weight of decay. Despite the downpour, the air around the property was eerily still, as if the storm dared not intrude. Ethan grabbed the pizza and walked up the creaking steps. The brass knocker on the door, shaped like a hollow-eyed skull, felt cold and damp. Before he could knock, the door swung open. No one was there. "Hello?" Ethan called out, stepping cautiously inside. The house smelled of damp earth and something sour. A faint humming sound came from somewhere deep within, like a generator on its last legs. A voice whispered from the shadows, "You're late." Ethan froze. The sound came from a figure in the corner of the room. He could barely make out its shape, a hunched silhouette with impossibly long arms. "I have your pizza," Ethan stammered, holding out the box. The figure didn't move but whispered again, louder this time. "You're late, Ethan." His name. He hadn't told them his name. The lights flickered and the door slammed shut behind him. Ethan spun around, but the knob wouldn't budge. The air felt heavy, pressing against his chest like a weight. The humming grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe, moving independently of the dim light. One shadow stretched toward him, elongating unnaturally across the floor. "Who's there?" Ethan demanded, his voice cracking. The figure in the corner moved. Its limbs cracked like dry branches as it unfolded to its full height, towering over him. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of pale green light. Ethan backed away. Tripping over the edge of a threadbare rug, he dropped the pizza box, its lid flying open. Inside was no pizza, just a single, blood-stained photograph. It was Ethan, standing in the Midnight Crust uniform, looking terrified. He hadn't posed for that picture. A child's laughter echoed through the house, shrill and unnatural. Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran, blindly searching for an exit. Every door led to another room, each more decrepit and nightmarish than the last. The walls pulsed like living tissue, and the floorboards groaned as if in pain. The humming turned into a deep, guttural growl. Ethan stumbled into a kitchen where knives hung from the ceiling by strands of hair. On the counter was a row of pizza boxes, each one bearing his name and a date, a different date for every box. His chest tightened as he opened one. Inside was a severed hand, clutching a name tag. It read, "Ethan, Trainee of the Month." A scream bubbled in his throat, but he didn't dare let it out. Something scraped against the kitchen floor behind him. He turned slowly, his breath hitching. The figure was there, closer now, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Its face came into view, a hollow, gaping void where features should have been. "Your shift is over," it rasped. Ethan bolted. He tore through the house, ignoring the whispers and the hands clawing at him from the walls. He found a staircase and raced up, desperate for any escape. At the top, he discovered a door with faint light seeping through the cracks. He burst through it only to find himself back in the kitchen. The knives dangled ominously, swaying as if mocking him. The figure appeared again, closer, its arms stretching unnaturally toward him. Ethan clutched at the countertop, trying to find anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against a cold, metallic object. A pizza cutter. Pathetic. The lights went out, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. Ethan's scream echoed through the house, cut short by a wet, crunching sound. When the storm passed, Redwood Lane was quiet again. Ethan's car was found abandoned in the cul-de-sac the next morning, the pizza box sitting neatly on the passenger seat. Inside was another photograph, this one showing the Midnight Crust staff, smiling except for Ethan, whose face had been scratched out. The manager hired a new driver the next day. Just one rule, he told them. Don't deliver to Redwood Lane after 11 p.m. The quiet town of Willow Ridge was known for its calm streets and charming residents, but everyone whispered about the old Talbot Manor. The house had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like dead skin. Locals claimed it was cursed. But for Mia, a pizza delivery driver trying to scrape together enough money for rent, curses were the least of her concerns. It was a slow, cold night when the order came in. The address? Shasha 13 Talbot Street. Her stomach dropped. She'd heard the rumors, how the house seemed to call people, how no one who entered ever spoke about it again. But the tip was massive, and Mia couldn't afford to turn it down. She loaded the pizza into her car and set off. The streets grew darker as she neared Talbot Street, the streetlights flickering weakly before dying completely. When her GPS announced her arrival, she stared at the house in front of her. Talbot Manor loomed like a rotting corpse, its once grand architecture crumbling under the weight of time. A dim light flickered in an upper window, though the house had no electricity. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, but a narrow path had been trampled through them, leading to the front porch. Mia hesitated. Her fingers hovered over her phone, tempted to call the number on the receipt and say the delivery was canceled. But then she remembered the rent notice stuck to her fridge. Clutching the pizza box, she walked up to the front door. The knocker was shaped like a twisted face, its hollow eyes staring at her. When she knocked, the sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house itself was empty and endless. No one answered. "Hello?" Mia called out, her voice trembling. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway. The air that spilled out was ice cold and smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The house seemed larger on the inside, the hallway stretching endlessly in both directions. A single candle burned on a table near the entrance, casting long, dancing shadows. "Hello?" She called again. A voice answered, faint and raspy, coming from deeper within the house. "In here." Mia's heart pounded. She took a tentative step forward, the shadows on the walls twisting unnaturally as she moved. The pizza box felt heavier in her hands, as though the house was trying to pull her down. The voice came again, closer this time. "Hurry. It's getting cold." She turned a corner and found a dining room. The table was set with fine china, though everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. At the head of the table sat a figure shrouded in darkness. "Your pizza," Mia said, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. She placed the box on the table and stepped back, but as she turned to leave, the door she had entered through was gone. "Mia," the figure whispered. She froze. How do you know my name?" The candlelight flared, illuminating the figure's face. It was a man, but his features were wrong, stretched, too sharp, his eyes sunken and glowing faintly. "You've brought me what I've been waiting for," he rasped, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. Mia backed away, her heart racing. "I'm just the delivery driver. I don't know anything." The man rose from his chair, his movements unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. "You are the delivery," he said. The walls began to ripple like water, the room twisting and contorting. The shadows on the walls grew larger, taking on forms, twisted faces and clawed hands that reached for her. Panicking, Mia turned and ran. Every door she opened led to the same hallway, stretching endlessly before her. The voices of the shadows grew louder, chanting her name, mocking her. Finally, she stumbled into a room that felt wrong. The air was thick, the walls pulsing like a heartbeat. At the center of the room was a mirror, cracked and smeared with something dark. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The reflection smiled, even though Mia wasn't. Its eyes glowed faintly, just like the man's. "Don't fight it," her reflection said, the voice distorted and layered. "You belong here now." The shadows closed in. Mia screamed, clawing at the walls, but the house swallowed her cries. The next morning, Mia's car was found abandoned outside Talbot Manor. The pizza box was still on the passenger seat, untouched. Weeks later, a new delivery driver at Mia's pizza place received an order for 13 Talbot Street. When he arrived, he swore the woman who opened the door looked exactly like the picture of Mia hanging on the break room wall. Except her eyes were glowing. The town of Silver Pines was unremarkable, save for one peculiar tradition. Every year, on the last Friday of November, the Midnight Feast was held. It wasn't a carnival or a festival. It was a mysterious event whispered about in hushed tones. The only rule was simple: never take an order to Silver Pines Cemetery after midnight. Sam, a new pizza delivery driver in town, wasn't one for superstition. He needed the money, and working the late shift paid well. He laughed off the warnings from his coworkers. Urban legends meant to spook newbies. But when the phone rang at 11:45 p.m. with an order for the cemetery, even Sam hesitated. The voice on the other end was low and distorted, almost crackling through the receiver. "One large pizza, extra cheese, delivered to the caretaker's cabin." It wasn't until he saw the promised tip, $100 cash, that he shrugged off his unease and loaded the pizza into his car. The streets were deserted as he drove, the occasional gust of wind rattling the trees. The cemetery came into view, its iron gates ajar, creaking in the cold breeze. Sam parked just outside, grabbing the pizza. The caretaker's cabin sat at the far edge of the graveyard, barely visible in the dim moonlight. As he walked through the gates, his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing against the stillness. Rows of weathered tombstones stretched out before him, their inscriptions worn away by time. The air was heavy, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Halfway through the graveyard, Sam noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped sharply, his breath now visible in the icy air. He quickened his pace, the pizza box warming his hands as he approached the small, dilapidated cabin. The door was slightly ajar, a faint yellow light spilling out onto the overgrown path. "Hello?" Sam called, knocking lightly. The door creaked open wider, revealing a room cluttered with old furniture and stacks of dusty books. A single candle burned on the table, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. No one answered. "I've got your pizza," Sam said, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding. The air inside was colder than outside, and the flickering candlelight seemed to grow dimmer. A voice, low and gravelly, came from the shadows. "You're just in time." Sam turned toward the sound, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner of the room sat a figure, hunched and still. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, its hands resting on its knees. You ordered pizza?" Sam stammered. The figure tilted its head slightly. "I did." Sam placed the pizza on the table and backed away. "That'll be $25. The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Sam's spine. "Oh, payment has already been arranged." The candlelight flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Sam glanced around nervously, his instincts screaming at him to leave. "Look, I just need to." The figure stood suddenly, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stepped into the light, revealing a face pale and sunken, its eyes black voids that seemed to pull at Sam's very soul. "You brought the feast," it rasped. The pizza box began to rattle on the table, its lid popping open. Sam stared in horror as the cheese bubbled and writhed, dark tendrils reaching out from the box like living things. The tendrils coiled and stretched toward him, the smell of sulfur filling the room. He turned to run, but the door was gone. The walls of the cabin seemed to shift and close in, the wood creaking like the groans of the dead. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnatural, its face splitting into a grotesque smile. "Stay. You're the guest of honor." The tendrils wrapped around Sam's legs, pulling him toward the table. He screamed, clawing at the floor, but the wood splintered beneath his fingers. The figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. The last thing Sam saw was the pizza box opening wider, its tendrils pulling him into the dark abyss inside. The next morning, Sam's car was found abandoned outside the cemetery gates, the engine still running. Inside the cabin, the only sign of his presence, was a single, untouched pizza box. When the local police opened it, they found a folded piece of paper inside. It read, "One delivery down, many more to go." That night, midnight feast orders started coming in from addresses no one recognized, but no one was brave enough to deliver them. The gas station at the edge of town had been a staple of Ash Hollow for decades. It wasn't much to look at, flickering neon lights, a single pump, an appealing sign, but it stayed open 24/7. The town's late-night pizza deliveries often stopped there, but drivers whispered about the missing mile on Route 13, the stretch of road just beyond the gas station that no GPS could map correctly. Jack, a night shift delivery driver, didn't believe in ghost stories. He laughed at his coworkers' warnings about strange orders and cursed addresses. So when a call came through just before midnight asking for a delivery to an address on Route 13, he shrugged it off. 31 Lost Pines Road, the caller said, their voice static-filled and distant. Jack plugged the address into his GPS, but it refused to load. Rolling his eyes, he grabbed the pizza, scribbled the directions down manually, and set off. The rain had just started, a soft drizzle that made the roads glisten like mirrors. He passed the gas station, the last bastion of light before the darkness of Route 13 swallowed him. The streetlights ended abruptly, leaving only his car's headlights to cut through the mist. The radio, which had been playing old rock songs, crackled before going silent. The road stretched endlessly before him, the trees on either side growing denser and more twisted. The GPS screen flickered before showing an error message. Recalculating. Jack's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The drizzle turned into a downpour, and the sound of the rain was deafening. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road behind him. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. Turning to look directly, he saw nothing. The road was empty. Shaking his head, he laughed nervously. "Get a grip, Jack." He continued driving, the tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:47 a.m. The road felt impossibly long, as though he'd been driving for hours. Then he saw it, a mailbox sticking out of the fog, the numbers 31 barely visible. A narrow, gravel driveway led to a small, dilapidated house. Its windows were dark, and the porch light flickered weakly. Jack parked, grabbed the pizza, and trudged through the rain. The air was thick, each breath heavy with the scent of wet earth. He knocked on the door. No answer. "Hello?" he called out, knocking again. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior. "Pizza delivery," he said, stepping cautiously inside. The house smelled of mildew and something sharp, like rust. A single candle burned on a table in the middle of the room, illuminating a stack of old yellowed newspapers. Jack set the pizza box down and turned to leave, but the door had vanished. He spun around, heart racing. The walls of the house were shifting, the wood groaning and stretching as though alive. "Hello?" he called again, his voice trembling. A sound came from the shadows, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails against wood. Jack turned toward the noise, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. In the corner of the room stood a figure, its back to him. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its limbs were impossibly long. "Your pizza's here," Jack stammered, stepping back. The figure twitched, its head snapping toward him. Its face was wrong, too pale, its features distorted as though stretched over something else. "You're late," it whispered, the voice layered and inhuman. Jack bolted toward where the door had been, slamming into the wall. The tapping grew louder, coming from all sides now. The room spun, the shadows moving like a living thing. He turned back to the figure, but it was gone. The pizza box on the table began to shake, its lid flying open. Inside, the pizza was gone, replaced by a single photograph. Jack picked it up with trembling hands. It was him, standing at the door of the house, pizza in hand, with the figure behind him. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. Then from above, a voice whispered, "You'll stay with us now." Jack looked up, just as the ceiling opened like a gaping mouth, shadows pouring down and wrapping around him. He screamed, clawing at the walls, but they pulled him into the darkness. When the rain stopped the next morning, the gas station clerk noticed Jack's car parked on the shoulder of Route 13, the pizza box still in the passenger seat. Inside the box was another photo, this one showing the missing mile, stretching endlessly under a blood-red sky. No one dared take another delivery to Route 13 after that. It was 11:58 p.m. when Lena got the call. She had been seconds away from clocking out after a long night of delivering pizzas. The caller's voice was low and strange, distorted as if it came from an old radio. Pepperoni and mushroom. Deliver to the Red House? Lena hesitated. Everyone in town knew the legend of the Red House. It sat deep in the woods at the end of an overgrown dirt road. Stories swirled about its dark past, murder, disappearances, strange lights in the windows. She glanced at the clock. 2 more minutes and the shift would have been over. But then she thought of the stack of bills waiting at home. She sighed, grabbed the pizza, and headed out. The directions were vague, but Lena knew the area well enough to piece them together. She turned onto the dirt road, her headlights cutting through the dense fog that clung to the trees like a shroud. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. Even the hum of her car seemed muffled, as if the forest was swallowing the sound. Finally, she saw it. The red house stood at the end of the road, its paint peeling, its windows dark. The house was enormous, leaning slightly to one side, as though the earth beneath it had given up. Lena parked and stepped out, clutching the pizza box tightly. The air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. She walked up the creaking porch steps and knocked. The door opened almost instantly, but no one was there. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing into the void. She took a tentative step inside. The interior was worse than the exterior. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and iron. The only light came from a faint glow deeper in the house, spilling out from an open doorway at the end of the hall. "Pizza delivery," Lena said, more to herself than anyone else. A whisper echoed through the house, soft and unintelligible. Her skin prickled. "I'm leaving the pizza here," she shouted, setting the box down on a small table near the door. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. Lena froze. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was coming from the glowing doorway. Against every instinct, she stepped forward. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move, shifting unnaturally as she walked. When she reached the doorway, she peered inside. The room was empty, except for a single chair facing an old television. The screen flickered with static, casting an eerie light across the room. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lena turned to leave, but the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, elongating toward her. Her breath hitched as she saw them, faces forming in the darkness. They had no eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to pull at her soul. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. "I need to get out of here," she whispered. The television screen changed, the static cleared, revealing a grainy black and white image. It was her, standing in the doorway, staring at the screen. Lena's blood ran cold. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the television, the image had changed. It now showed her standing in the same spot, but behind her, one of the shadowy figures was reaching out, its skeletal hand inches from her shoulder. She screamed and ran. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the door she had entered through now impossibly far away. The whispers were deafening now, layered with sobs and faint laughter. When she finally reached the door, she yanked it open and sprinted to her car. She didn't dare look back as she sped down the dirt road, the tires skidding on the loose gravel. When she reached the main road, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from the delivery app. "Thank you for your delivery. Tip, $666. Her heart sank. She looked in her rearview mirror and saw the red house, still visible despite the distance. In the upper window, a shadow stood watching her. When Lena returned to the pizza shop, the manager frowned. "Where's the pizza?" "What?" Lena stammered. "I left it at the house." The manager shook his head. "You didn't deliver anything tonight. There wasn't a call after 11:30. Are you okay?" Lena's stomach dropped. She turned to her car and froze. Sitting in the passenger seat was the pizza box. Written across the lid in smeared dark red letters were 3 words: "See you soon." It was a little after midnight when the order came in, and Danny was the only driver left on shift. He'd been about to lock the door when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was strange, low and gravelly with an odd echo. "1 large pizza," it said. "Meat lovers, deliver to Barrow Farm Road." Danny frowned. Barrow Farm Road wasn't on his delivery map. It wasn't anywhere near town, for that matter. He hesitated until the voice added, "I'll pay double your usual tip. Cash." Double the tip? Danny couldn't refuse. He jotted down the directions the caller gave, loaded the pizza, and started driving. The road stretched further than he expected, twisting through dense woods that seemed darker than normal. His headlights struggled against the thick fog creeping in from the trees, and the farther he drove, the worse it got. The GPS on his phone refused to work, the screen flickering before going dark. Danny cursed and glanced at the written directions. He was sure he'd followed them correctly, but the road ahead seemed endless. Finally, he spotted a mailbox leaning crookedly at the edge of the road. The name had been scratched off, but the number matched the address. 666 Barrow Farm Road. He turned onto the narrow dirt path, which led to an old farmhouse at the top of a hill. The house was in ruins, its windows shattered and the roof sagging. A single, weak light flickered in one of the upper windows. Danny parked and got out, clutching the pizza box. The air was colder here, sharp and biting. The farmhouse felt like it was watching him. He knocked on the door, his breath visible in the chill air, no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark hallway. "Hello?" Danny called. A faint voice came from deep inside the house. "Come in." Danny hesitated but stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the smell of damp wood and decay filled his nose. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, leading into darkness. "I'm just here to deliver the pizza," he called. The voice came again, softer this time. "We've been waiting for you." Danny's skin crawled. He placed the pizza box on a nearby table and turned to leave, but the door was gone. In its place was a wall of old, rotting wood. Panic set in. He spun around, looking for another exit, but the house had changed. The hallway was longer now, the walls lined with framed photographs. He stepped closer to one, his heart pounding. The photo showed a blurry figure standing on the porch of this very house, holding a pizza box. The figure wore a uniform identical to his. Danny stumbled back, his breath quickening. He looked at the next photo. It showed the same figure, but this time they were inside the house, the shadows closing in behind them. The third photo made his blood run cold. It was him, standing right where he was, looking at the photographs, terror etched on his face. A low laugh echoed through the house. The shadows in the hallway began to move, stretching and twisting toward him. He turned and ran, sprinting down the endless corridor. Doors appeared on either side, slamming open as he passed, revealing glimpses of horrific scenes. Shadowy figures clawing at walls, faces frozen in silent screams, and something massive moving just out of sight. Finally, he stumbled into a room lit by a single swinging bulb. In the center was a table. On the table sat the pizza box. The voice came again, louder and closer this time. "Join the feast." The lid of the pizza box flipped open on its own. Inside was a mirror instead of a pizza, reflecting Danny's terrified face. But something was wrong. In the reflection, his face began to change. His skin grew pale, his eyes darkened, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "No!" Danny screamed, backing away. The shadows closed in, pulling at him, dragging him toward the table. He clawed at the floor, but it was no use. The last thing he saw was his reflection laughing at him as the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, a new driver found Danny's car abandoned at the edge of Barrow Farm Road. The engine was running, and the pizza was still in the passenger seat. When they opened the box, it was empty, except for a handwritten note. "Your turn." It was a quiet Tuesday night when Chris, a college student working late shifts at a local pizza joint, got the call. The voice on the other end was faint, almost a whisper. "I need 2 large pizzas," the caller said. "1 cheese, 1 sausage. Deliver to Blackwood Manor." Chris froze. Everyone in town had heard of Blackwood Manor. It had been abandoned for decades, sitting at the top of Hollow Ridge, shrouded by thick woods. People said the last family who lived there disappeared without a trace. Kids dared each other to go there, but no one ever lasted long. "Are you sure?" Chris asked, trying to sound casual. The voice on the other end chuckled softly, sending chills down his spine. "I'm sure. Don't keep us waiting." The line went dead. Chris debated blowing off the delivery, but the caller had promised a $200 tip. That was too good to pass up. He loaded the pizzas into his car and drove out of town, the roads growing narrower and darker as he approached the ridge. The path leading to Blackwood Manor was overgrown, the headlights barely cutting through the dense fog. The house loomed at the top of the hill, its silhouette jagged and broken. Its windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring down at him. Chris parked at the bottom of the driveway, grabbing the pizzas and his flashlight. The air was unnaturally cold, and the woods were eerily silent. As he approached the front door, it swung open on its own, groaning on rusted hinges. "Hello?" Chris called, stepping inside. The interior was even worse than he'd imagined. Cobwebs covered every corner, and the smell of mold and decay was overpowering. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he walked into what must have once been a grand foyer. "Your pizzas are here," he said, his voice trembling. A soft sound came from upstairs, a faint giggle, like a child's laugh. Chris froze. "Hello?" The giggle came again, followed by footsteps, slow and deliberate. "This isn't funny," Chris muttered, setting the pizzas down on a nearby table. He turned to leave, but the door was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, the wallpaper peeling to reveal something dark and wet underneath. He whipped around, only to see the pizzas gone. The table was now empty, and the faint giggling had turned into whispers. "Stay," a voice hissed from the shadows. Chris's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the dark hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. He backed up, his heart pounding, until he bumped into something solid. He turned and screamed. A figure stood behind him, its face obscured by a veil of shadows. Its hands were skeletal, its fingers impossibly long. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening hum. Chris stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. He looked down and saw the pizza boxes. They were open now, but instead of food, they were filled with worms and what looked like chunks of rotting meat. He gagged, scrambling to his feet. The figure began to move toward him, its head twitching unnaturally. Chris ran, bolting down the hall. The house seemed alive now. The walls pulsed, and the floor beneath him shifted like quicksand. He reached a staircase and climbed, the whispers chasing him. At the top of the stairs, he found a single door slightly ajar. Without thinking, he shoved it open and slammed it shut behind him. The room was empty, except for a mirror mounted on the far wall. It was massive, its frame ornate and black, covered in carvings of faces screaming in agony. Chris approached the mirror cautiously, his breath fogging the glass. At first, he saw only his reflection, wide-eyed and pale. But then the reflection began to change. Behind him, shadowy figures appeared, their faces grotesque and twisted. Their mouths moved in unison, though no sound came from them. Chris turned to look, but the room was empty. When he faced the mirror again, his own face was gone, replaced by one of the twisted, screaming figures. The whispers turned into a roar, and the glass of the mirror began to crack, spiderwebbing outward. "Join us," a voice boomed, low and guttural. The mirror shattered, and the darkness from within spilled out, engulfing Chris. He screamed, his voice lost in the black void. The next morning, Chris's car was found, parked at the base of Hollow Ridge, its doors wide open. Inside the car were the 2 empty pizza boxes, but Chris was nowhere to be found. Later that week, the pizza shop got another call. 1 large pepperoni, the same faint voice said, delivered to Blackwood Manor. No one took the order, but the next night, the shop's front window had a single word scrawled across it in what looked like blood. It was a slow night at the pizza shop, and Mia was counting down the minutes until her shift ended. The phone rang just as she was about to close up. The voice on the other end was soft but strange, like someone whispering through static. "I need a delivery. 1 large pizza. The address is 135 Willow Hollow." Mia frowned. Willow Hollow was on the outskirts of town, deep in the woods. The old residents used to call it a cursed place, something about people disappearing there. But the man on the phone sounded insistent, offering a $50 tip for the trouble. Mia grabbed the pizza and got into her car. The drive was uneventful at first, but the further she went, the darker it got. The trees along the road seemed to close in, their branches tangling like skeletal fingers. When she reached Willow Hollow, her headlights illuminated a small, crumbling house at the end of a narrow path. The windows were dark and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. Mia hesitated. Something about the place made her skin crawl, but she figured she'd drop the pizza and leave quickly. She walked up the steps, pizza in hand, and knocked. No answer. "Hello?" she called out. "Pizza delivery." The door creaked open wider, revealing a dark interior. A faint, flickering light came from somewhere deep inside the house. Mia stepped inside cautiously. The air was cold, damp, and carried a faint metallic smell. "I'll just leave this here," she said, placing the pizza on a dusty table near the entrance. She turned to leave, but a voice stopped her. "Wait." Mia froze. The voice was soft and raspy, coming from the direction of the flickering light. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The light grew brighter, and she saw the outline of a figure standing in the doorway at the end of the hall. "You forgot the napkins," the voice whispered. "What?" Mia said, confused. The figure stepped forward, but as it moved closer, Mia's confusion turned to terror. Its body was impossibly thin, its limbs long and angular. Its face was featureless, except for a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. "Stay," it said, its grin widening as it reached for her. Mia screamed and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in front of her. She pounded on it, her heart racing. Behind her, the sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder. "Don't go," the voice said, now right behind her. She spun around to see the figure crawling toward her, its limbs bending at horrifying angles. Its grin never wavered. In a panic, Mia grabbed a nearby chair and swung it, but it passed right through the creature as if it were made of smoke. "Why are you afraid?" it whispered, tilting its head. "You brought the feast. Now you are part of it." The walls of the house began to change, dark tendrils creeping out from the cracks, wrapping around Mia's legs and pulling her down. She screamed, clawing at the floor, but the tendrils were too strong. The last thing she saw before being dragged into the darkness was the creature's face, leaning close, its mouth opening wider and wider until it engulfed everything. The next day, Mia's car was found abandoned on the side of the road, the pizza still in the passenger seat. The box was open, but instead of a pizza, there was a photograph inside. A picture of Mia standing in the doorway of the house, her face twisted in fear. No one could explain how the photo had gotten there, and no one dared take another order to Willow Hollow again. The pizza shop was about to close when the call came through. Mike, a new delivery driver, groaned at the timing but answered anyway. "I'd like to order a pizza," the voice said. It was hollow and slow, almost robotic. "One large pepperoni. Delivered to 13 Crooked Oak Lane." Mike frowned. He had never heard of that address, but it sounded close enough. The man on the phone insisted on paying in cash, offering him a $100 tip. Tempted by the extra cash, Mike agreed, despite the sinking feeling in his gut. The drive to Crooked Oak Lane was unsettling. The road was poorly lit, and the trees on either side seemed to lean inward as if trying to block the path. His GPS froze, its screen stuck on a loading wheel. When he finally reached the house, Mike's stomach turned. It was an ancient, decrepit structure with a sagging roof and walls covered in ivy. A faint, flickering light glowed from one of the upstairs windows. He parked, grabbed the pizza, and walked up the cracked stone path. The house seemed to groan in the wind, and the air smelled of damp earth and something metallic. Mike knocked on the door, which swung open slowly before he could finish. "Hello," he called, stepping inside. The house was dark, except for a dim lantern on a small table near the entrance. Dust hung in the air, and the wooden floor creaked under his feet. "I have your pizza," he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. No response. A cold draft swept through the house, causing the lantern to flicker. Mike's instincts screamed at him to leave, but something compelled him to step further inside. At the end of the hallway, a door creaked open by itself. A faint, rhythmic sound, like the ticking of a clock, emanated from within. "Look, I'm just going to leave this here," Mike said, placing the pizza on the lantern-lit table, but as he turned to leave, the ticking stopped. "Wait!" A voice called softly from the open door. Mike froze. His heart raced, but he turned slowly toward the sound. Inside the room, he saw an old rocking chair swaying back and forth, though no one sat in it. The walls were covered in strange, childlike drawings, stick figures with distorted faces, red smudges that looked like blood, and jagged black shapes that loomed over everything. Suddenly, the lantern's light dimmed, plunging the house into near darkness. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered from right behind him. Mike spun around, but no one was there. He backed away, stumbling into the open room. The rocking chair creaked louder, moving faster now, as if an invisible force pushed it. The door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Mike's flashlight flickered as he scanned the room. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners, growing taller and darker. The drawings on the walls began to change. The stick figures now had hollow eyes, and their mouths stretched into wide, gaping screams. One by one, the black shapes from the drawings began to peel away from the walls, taking form in the room. Mike stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam illuminated a figure crouched in the corner. A twisted, human-like thing with elongated limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Hungry," it rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. Mike screamed and lunged for the door, pounding on it with all his strength. Behind him, the shadows grew closer, the sound of skittering claws echoing around the room. The thing from the corner lunged, its bony hand grazing his shoulder. The touch burned like ice, and Mike felt his strength drain. With a desperate cry, he threw his weight against the door, breaking it open and tumbling into the hallway. He didn't stop running, dashing out of the house and into his car. He floored the gas pedal, his tires screeching as he sped away from Crooked Oak Lane. When he finally reached the pizza shop, he was shaking so badly he could barely stand. He stumbled inside, trying to explain what had happened. His manager frowned. "Mike, what are you talking about? There was no order for Crooked Oak Lane tonight." Mike stared in disbelief. "What? I took it. I went there." The manager pointed at the order log. There was no record of a call from 13 Crooked Oak Lane. Mike's blood ran cold. When he returned to his car, the pizza box was sitting in the passenger seat. He knew he hadn't brought it back. Scrawled across the lid in a dark, oily substance were 2 words, "Come back."